Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with another episode of Receivables Roundtable. Today, I am here with the other Adam, who's kind of on the other side of the world, Mr. Adam Wood, who is an industry veteran coming out of Australia. How you doing today, Adam?
I'm very good, Adam. It's awesome to reconnect and to be chatting with you.
Absolutely. The last time that we got to hang out was at RMAI 2020, I believe, a few weeks before the world shut down. And we're going to get to that. But for anybody who wasn't as lucky as I was to meet you at the RMAI conference, could you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got to the seat that you're in today?
I will, absolutely. Thanks, mate. Little bit of a unique background in receivables or collections. Mum and Dad started a business. Some might know Neil Wood, who sort of pioneered the international debt collection industry. He had a collection agency and an investigation company here in Melbourne, Australia, 45 years ago. Saw a global vision, set up in Hong Kong, JV in Hong Kong, and sort of from there expanded very quickly as a partnership, a little bit like a franchise of sorts or an industry association, where built partner networks into about 100 countries through Asia, into Europe, into the US, into Africa and Latin America. And we, I guess as the business, it was called TCM Group. Some might know of an international group called TCM. That was the origins, Total Credit Management Group. And it was pretty much to try and internationalize debt collection, share a partner network or a member network internationally, work on behalf of clients here in Australia and service their international business, and then exchange cases amongst those. So our sort of sweet spot was that we wouldn't necessarily go after domestic business per se. We'd go after international. We'd go to the banks and the lenders and the healthcare providers and say, if you have, a debtor that's located overseas, how are you going to collect them? Nowadays, that's a lot easier to do with, the world being so small and digital technology the way it is. But 40 years ago, there was only one way to do that, and that was with boots on the ground. And so Dad built a partner network into about 100 countries, and that was sort of the origins of it. GCS later became the family business that was the GCS Credit Network or Global Credit Solutions. That became GCS Credit and GCS Risk, and we sort of diversified the business from receivables and credit into risk management as well. And then the compliance train hit us in maybe 2010, 2011, 12. We could start to see the expectations in our clients' contracts around privacy data and cyber, governance, risk and compliance, quality assurance, quality management. And for us as a global network of a lot of SMEs in emerging or mature but also emerging markets, that became a real challenge for us to manage the compliance expectations of our clients. So we sort of pivoted sideways, and we've developed like we've all done now. We've either started a podcast or we've built a tech platform, and we sort of got into both of those. And now we're founder and CEO of a company called Certified By, which is trying to democratize risk and essential compliance, primarily for an SME sector. So long background in collections. It'd be great to talk more about it. But yeah, sort of moved into the tech space now.
Okay, well, help me understand the Certified By. Like, how has that evolved? I know when we first started talking, we were both kind of building compliance companies in our respective markets and kind of working through the challenges that you face, not just from a regulatory, but from a technology and adoption standpoint. So what are you guys up to today over at Certified By?
So the challenge for us was that we didn't want to create a technology platform. We certainly didn't want to get into the compliance space. We, as a global network made up of a lot of SMEs or small and medium-sized businesses, we were looking all around the world for an off-the-shelf compliance framework, looking at, say, SOC 2 or ISO standards, best practice standards, but one that was simplified for an SME because, as you probably know, best practice compliance is largely an enterprise game. Very expensive, very costly, very complicated, and a lot of SMEs just choose to either ignore it because of the complexity and the cost, or try and go it alone. We were trying to find a standard or a tool that we could upskill, educate, assess, and then visualize to our clients that we put in place all the protections and the controls around, particularly privacy, cyber, and data, but quality management. And it just didn't exist. There's all the best practice and enterprise stuff. And for us, we couldn't find anything that was fit for an SME of an international nature. And so we started reverse engineering the procurement documents. We'd find our contractual documents. We'd put 5 of them together, find the consistencies. And we found largely ISO 9001, ISO 27001, SOC 2. These were essentially the requirements within the contracts. But as you understand, client contracts are similar, but they're always different. And so the repetitive nature of trying to understand, dissect, and comply with contractual terms was a great challenge for us as a head office to this global network, and for our partners, particularly those in emerging regions. So we originally built a tool for ourselves to be able to sort of, it's a little bit like an LMS, a little bit of an assessment form, where we got our partners to conduct an assessment so that we could understand where were they, high, medium, and low risk. We'd help them with remediating risks, so that at the time we could go back to our clients with like a global traffic light system, where we would have a map of the world and we'd say, in these countries they're green, they can meet SOC 2 or ISO. Yellow is they're working on it, and we can show you to what standard their compliance measures are. And red, well, you might not want to touch them because they might not meet your requirements. And that was the origins. We built that into our own little platform, and we took it to a couple of banks, and they said, hey, can we license this off you? Because what you've touched on is third-party risk, vicarious liability. And we didn't realize at the time that that was a much bigger issue. And sort of we've been on this very long path to try and work out, how do we turn this tool that we built for ourselves into a startup and a standalone business that's trying to solve a broader area of risk and essential compliance, with all of the connotations that includes, for SMEs, which is largely a sector that are otherwise either ignorant or trying to ignore risk and compliance. So it's been a challenge for us to try and work out, what should the product be, what should the offering be. And so we've now got three pillars of cyber and data, so cyber essentials and information security, workplace essentials, looking at health and safety and HR, and now the very fast-moving ESG or sustainability standards that we're starting to see filter through contracts. So they're sort of the three pillars that we work in, and it's a SaaS-based RegTech for SMEs primarily.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And risk management, I think, is the criteria remains somewhat the same on a global scale. It's just the details that tend to change on a contract or a jurisdictional basis. So I feel like a lot of the technology and the requirements are all moving in the same direction over time, but actually getting there, definitely comes with its challenges. So I'm sure that you guys have had some interesting endeavors trying to cross some of those international bridges when it comes to compliance, and even just establishing a universal understanding of what that compliance ultimately equates to.
100%, mate. And look, that's largely what brought me to Vegas in 2020. Was Jan Steger and Don Maurice and I were working with Erwin Faulkner from the Fenker. At that time, you remember GDPR was right in was on the lips of everyone, and was the biggest driving issue. CCPA in the US, and so in Australia we've got the CDR in Singapore. That, like, everywhere seemed to be moving down the privacy issue, the data protection regulatory frameworks, and there was zero consistency. And like, I imagine it's unfortunately probably still the same in the US, where you've got was it 8 or 9 states that have their own data protection standard or consumer data rights standard, but zero federal uniformity. And so that's still the great problem internationally, is that I guess everybody's defaulted to the GDPR because it's the gold standard, and if you comply with that, then you probably comply everywhere. And that was one of the things that brought us together, is was to try to harmonise and, I guess, unify a standard on data protection, cyber standards, so that we could refer business internationally. For us, the challenge was, if we received a case or an assignment from someone in Europe, do we have to comply with GDPR if we get a case from someone in California, or the consumer was based in California and we're getting a case from a creditor in Australia? What standard do you comply to? And that was a great challenge for us. So we tried at that stage to put together an organisation called the International Credit and Collection Alliance, with FENCA and ACA and RMAI, and here in Australia the AICM and the IMA, and we had this uniform approach to saying, this is an issue that we want to try and tackle internationally. And so we had the executives of those industry bodies come together to try and say, let's share our knowledge, rather than everybody working in silos with their own domestic agenda. Let's see if we could address it from an international perspective, and that was really heartwarming to see that there was a consensus at these levels. Sadly, we had a pandemic thrown our way, and that forced everybody to reassess their priorities. But it is something that we hope to readdress and come back to, because I think these challenges of regulation are only going to evolve. So the more we can work together, the better, I think.
I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, look, working across the United States from a data privacy perspective is a lot like working internationally because I'm dealing with 50 sovereign nations from a data privacy perspective because the federal government has failed to step in and provide some insights as to what might be a good standard. And so you've got all of these, like, I'm going to say quirky requirements across a lot of those that don't necessarily stack well on top of each other, and it does create some incredibly complicated environments. And I agree that, trying to help the consumer in data privacy, I'm all for it, and on all fronts. However, setting a standard would make it a lot easier to manage that versus these individual state governments making decisions that may or may not have the background to be making. So, like, the smaller the entity that's making this rule, the more that you have to look at, is this the right group to be addressing this? It's the same
Hmm.
reason that I've avoided, anything rule related as it comes to artificial intelligence. I don't understand it deep enough for me to be affecting any kind of change like that. And I think we have to look at data privacy very much in the same way. Although I feel like data privacy is one of those things where we don't really have a whole lot of it, and being able to lock down your data or demand the erasing of that data and actually have people follow through with that, or organizations follow through with that, would be incredible. So hopefully that is something that comes back up into the forefront over the coming years. Although I feel like it hasn't been the buzzword in the news cycle lately, but I'm sure that that is a short-lived drought.
Well, and it's interesting, mate. I was on a session with the Arizona State Bar. They did a presentation. I was invited as a panelist on last year and again only a few months ago on the topic of the international harmonization of AI regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And GDPR and data privacy kept coming up as a reference point that, if we can't get that right and harmonize regulation around data privacy, how are we meant to even understand the challenges of AI harmonization and when you've got potentially bad actors out there? So it's a very topical point you make, mate. And I mean, do you have a view on where data privacy? I mean, it was all the rage with GDPR, and everybody kept saying, well, in our circles, it was like, is this the next Y2K, or is this a real thing? Is this going to be a real problem? And obviously, we've seen for those that enforce new standards, very much it is a real thing. Do you see a nationalisation or a federal regulation ever evolving in the US? When I was meeting with Don and Jan, I got to understand some of the challenges with within the US around why that may never happen because of not least political differences. Where do you see a harmonisation of that, mode, or is it just too challenging?
So this is going to sound strange, but I think one of the biggest challenges in getting that regulation together is the regulators themselves. And what I mean by that is everybody's at a grab for power. And when they're all grabbing for power, they're fighting each other over who should get to write the standard instead of trying to write a good standard.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point, either one of the state rules is going to trigger the federal government to take an action, which is quite possible, or there'll be some catastrophic event that forces it back into the spotlight, and it will be addressed when it's in the spotlight. But I think you've got multiple organizations that want to regulate things, and it's about who gets this level of control. Now, I think the states also, California, and a handful of others have started putting some of these things in place. It would be nice, I would say, at the least, if they looked at each other's work and maybe built off of that. I feel like that would be a much more progressive path towards an actual solution. Because regardless of where you sit politically, I feel like data privacy is one of those things that people tend to come together on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think even as a capitalist, right? Like, it's something that uh, you want to protect your own data, and you want to protect the data that you manage and control, because with data comes risk. So I don't know if we're ever really I don't know if we're going to see it anytime soon. We're only going to see it come through from a federal level if there comes a point in time in which there's either an event, or for another purpose or reason, it's brought back to the forefront of the news cycle. But I feel like the political engine here is driven a lot by the news cycle.
Right, right. And it's not the soup du jour. It's not the topic of the day, like you said. I think the heat's come out of it. It has elsewhere around the world. What would be now post challenges and shutdowns? Is there what would be the greatest challenges right now in the US that the industry is facing,
I
from
would say the
even through
economic
that
environment.
compliance lens and regulatory lens?
So I would say the economic environment. I mean, if you look at what's going on from an inflationary standpoint, and you have all of this that's free money that was sloshing around the economy, a lot of that was used to pay debts, but a lot of that was also used to incur new debts. And so people took what money they were receiving in a lot of instances and bought cars that came with car payments, right? So they used this little thing that ultimately I think exasperated the debt. And if I look back to, like, we had a fantastic keynote speaker at the RMAI annual conference this year who came from TransUnion, one of the credit bureaus in the United States, and talked about basically look at what's going on with delinquencies, look what's going on with delinquency vintages, and just the understanding of what is actually happening. I think that economic threat, because what happens if a whole bunch of new accounts fall into the marketplace? Well, there's higher volumes, right, but a lower propensity to pay. And so
Yeah.
this balancing act, I'm not quite sure where it's going to land, but I would say that organizations are preparing themselves for that more than anything. Now,
Hmm.
hopefully, it will also be a catalyst that drives more, um, let's say, more people to employment, because I
Yeah.
think you saw really high unemployment rates, and then it all of a sudden became really hard to hire anybody, and there wasn't that much free money that was sloshing around. So I think the economy has started to change, and you're seeing more of the gig economy, the one-off jobs, or the people that are freelancing from home. We're currently going through the process of hiring writers, and a lot of the writers that we're talking with don't want to come to an office, don't want to participate in that, right? Like, the world has changed for them.
Mm.
And so I think that mentality is definitely a major challenge. And then the communication methods, because you can't pick up the phone the way that you once could, right?
Mhm.
So getting people on the phone and having those discussions, now it requires these digital strategies. Now, Reg F opened up those opportunities for us to have those types of digital communications and to better understand the guardrails around those train tracks. But I think what we're missing is that it did not solve the technical problems, the email deliverability, the SMS deliverability, the terms of use on social media networks, and helping even the regulators to understand that you can't just start blasting out direct messages to everybody. That even though it may be okay from a legal perspective, and that's still to be tested, but is it okay from a technical perspective, right? And so I feel like a lot of that is starting to come together now. There was a rapid change across not only the industry but the country, since 2020, and how that's actually going to shake out. I feel like things are going to have to slow down before we can predict it, because reacting to everything on a dime is dangerous over time.
Yeah. Great summary, mate. One of that just it points me to one of the reasons we created GCS or
Mm,
TCM, GCS, later certified by was with the consolidation of industries, every kind of industry, right, through merger and acquisitions and acquisition after acquisition. Like even in Australia now, we were one of the smaller family mum and pop collection shops that was acquired by one of the bigger agencies, and that evolved in many different ways for us. But that we've seen that happen here in Australia. I'm sure it's happening in the US. Are there many? Is there a space now for mum and pop shops? I'd sort of look at through the lens of what you were talking about, these economic challenges bring to it, productivity efficiencies, the how in which the consumers want to be communicated. Technology and innovation has changed our industry in my lifetime in the industry so dramatically. I think back to the 80s to now, and you look at players like True Accord and the AI driven platforms and consumer centric, conversations rather than door knocking collectors. When I lived in the States in 98 and I traveled there as a 21-year-old and I worked with, at that time, Dad was very good friends with the board of ACA and some with
mm,
RMAI. And so I worked and lived with um, Harry Strauser, 2 and 3, and Vic York and Jim Henry and John Dunn and some of these heavyweights that were all the executives back then. And I got to sit and work on the collection floor and I got to learn about the FDCBA and about the way in which collections was conducted and is it done the same way? Because I know in Australia it's changed dramatically. Technology is driving it, and then customer expectations are driving that technology play. Um, is there still a space for, and I know there's layers to that question, but is there still a space for SMEs in collections in the US or in receivables in the US?
So, from my perspective, I would say yes. And I think the challenge, a lot of the smaller shops that you see that are being compressed on right now had a specialization in medical debt. And medical debt has been, a big thing in the United States for a long time. And I think a lot of those smaller shops were very focused on it. With the changes to credit reporting and changes to like you can't report, can't report it for a year, can't report it unless it's over $500. But like with all of these changes to the credit reporting and kind of the compression of that medical space, I think that's where that challenge has been for those groups. I think that there's always going to be a place for those that are collecting on auto loans and credit cards and student loans and retail loans, and especially for the small business, because how does a small business exist if it can't collect its money, right? And I'll go back to the smartest thing I ever heard in college. There's three things that matter in any business: the cash flow, the timing of the cash flow, and the risk associated with that cash flow. And so I will carry that forward forever. But what's a small business to do? Right. And they can't go running to a multi international debt collection operation that's getting 100,000 accounts a month from, 1,000 different clients, because there's not a place for that. Like there's still a place for accounts to be collected. And sometimes that second voice or having that moderator in between the negotiation for the settlement of a debt, even whether it be commercial, like there's a lot of those opportunities. The debt's never going to go away. No matter what happens with the economy, credit and collections will continue to exist. But I think that the smaller mom and pop shops were a lot more popular. But there was a lot more of them. I think a lot have consolidated, but part of that comes over time too, because you had, if you look early in the United States collection industry, right, and we go back to FDCPA days, why was there a concentration of people in Buffalo? Well, there was a giant collection agency in Buffalo, New York, that ceased to exist, and all these managers and executives went out and started their own shops. So you have all of a sudden had this large concentration of small organizations. I think there's always going to be a place for both sides of that equation, because the big dogs are going to continue to acquire, and they're going to acquire clients and they're going to acquire opportunity. But there's always a space for the little guy as long as he's willing to do it the right way. I don't believe that the barriers to entry have gotten to a point in which nobody can enter. Do you have to make a significant investment? Yes. But if I wanted to open a retail shop, I got to buy a lot of inventory too. So any way that I want to look at it, if I'm going to start a business, it's going to cost some money. So you might not be able to bootstrap it the way that you could have in the 70s, 80s, maybe even the early 90s. But I think it's a little bit of a different environment, because the mid-size shop, I mean, even the debt buyers that I've been associated with through the years were never 25,000 people. They were always 50 people. It was never like that huge. I would call that a small to medium sized business. I mean, I don't know if you're going to have like 3 people collecting at this point, but there's a little bit of a balance. Have you seen a change in Australia, or has it kind of remained somewhat consistent?
No, I mean, look, the acquisitions and the consolidation of the industry has been at play for quite some time. We've got, it's consolidated into fewer, larger providers. We had one of the agents, one of the collection agencies that we actually sold our domestic operations to at some point. They just shut. They wound up. They were one of the first listed here, and so there was a race. There was a race to be the first listed agency here, and so they had two different leaders in the industry that were sort of vying for the first listed agency in Australia. And so they were on this massive acquisition play back in late 90s, probably early 2000s, sorry. And Dad's business, our business was involved in one of that, and he sort of sold to one and then had a clause to be able to exit out of that, and very successfully exited out of that just before the deal closed, and then sold to another. Neither of them are around now. So there was, and like any consolidation, there's 2 ways to do it. Do you come in and rewrite the technology and you standardize everything, or do you let it run alone? And there was different approaches to doing that. That was an example. There's since been others that have come to the fore and really are successful and have shown how a listed, large, automated, AI-driven, consumer-centric, agency or receivables management agency would work. But there has been a lot of consolidation. There's a lot less, mum and dad, smaller type, shops around, largely driven by regulation and compliance. If you think about PCI compliance and AML KYC and, the fintech, the boom in fintech now, and the technology that drives can you provide it? Can you afford to provide it? If you don't, it's such a commitment to take on the innovative tech that's now expected of a collection agency. Can you maximize it? What if I don't want to be the next big thing in technology and receivables? If I just want to be a small agency collecting, that seems to be much harder to do now here in Australia. And I think we're seeing that for us. If you look at, say, Asia Pacific as an example, there are so many emerging parts of Asia, and you know India very well. So I'd point to your knowledge there. We set up a JV in India 10 years ago or so, and that was a brilliant partner that we worked with. We had mixed experiences there because it's more the cultural norms, it's the expectations. Is there the
It was even the view
core
of credit
system?
reporting until recently. Like it wasn't as important of a factor from a financial perspective.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so the same with I would argue my experience, and again, we've sort of been out of the coalface of collections and receivables for the last few years with certified by, but that's been a trend that I've seen in mature markets. It's been a consolidation. In the emerging markets, it's been a professionalization. It's been really a learning they've gained in leaps and bounds because perhaps some of that knowledge of those smaller agencies moving into bigger agencies has been shared downstream. We've got a strong footprint in Africa, Asia, Baltic CIS region, which obviously is challenging with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but we've got a strong footprint of boots on the ground and agents and partners that we've worked with for a very long time, and we're starting to see those expectations change, the compliance awareness, because a lot of if the technical capability are there, if is one thing, are the consumers aware of best practice credit standards and the way in which what does credit mean something? You mentioned collections have been around a long time. That always used to say it's the second oldest industry, right?
Mhm.
And so moving from baseball bats to writs and summonses has been the professionalisation of the industry that we've seen through Dad's eye, that I've seen through Dad's eyes. We're seeing that in emerging markets as well, and so it's only a matter of time, I think, until you see the larger players recognise that and perhaps try and move in. I'm sure it's already happening in many cases. Back to you, mate. The move from contingency debt collection, what I grew up on, right? No collect, no fee. Maybe you get an upfront fee, to purchase debt, and really understanding for me the differences between, say, ACA and RMAI, and that they are very different membership bases servicing different elements to receivables, I guess. How is that continued? Is the rate the rate at which receivables purchase debt is occurring, is that changing the industry, or is there still contingency place for collections?
I think it's still both, because I think when you look at the debt buying industry, debt buying is focused on some specific products, and there's different groups have their own lane that they like to stay within, right?
Yeah.
So you have different groups that have expertise on a variety of different products, but they tend to stay down their same lane. I think when it comes to like ACA, it's a little bit more focused on the collection agency and the resources for the collection agency themselves, whereas RMAI is more focused on, I would say, the debt buyer, and more the executive level. So
Mm.
I think that there's a place for all of it, because I find that the perspectives come together quite nicely. There's also NCBA, which is the Creditors Bar Association, which is kind of looking at it from a legal perspective. So I think back in the day, people looked at the associations and said, oh, ACA is collectors, NCBA is the attorneys, and RMAI is the debt buyers. And I feel like that line has blurred somewhat significantly, especially when it comes to RMAI. And that was part of their rebranding from the Debt Buyers Association to the Receivables Management Association International. But I think
Mm.
each organization has their own kind of flavor in the way that they're doing it. ACA has a lot of state units that are feeding a mothership, whereas RMAI is a mothership and operates its own within the states. And so I think it's just different outlooks. But honestly, I've really enjoyed working with both organizations, right? As president of RMAI and serving on that board for about the last 9 years. But over the last couple of years, I've been spending a lot of time at the ACA events, and getting to know that side of the world, and feeling like I have a better understanding of the collectors and the actual efforts that are going into recover that, because I came into this industry from a banker's perspective, right?
Mm,
Looking at the finance, looking at, okay, now I have this money, like how am I going to go collect on it? And then working through those different vendors, but better understanding how what those vendors are going through, what they're trying to manage, and what their business is really like has been insightful for me. Now,
mm,
owning ComplyArm, I got to audit and write policy and procedure for debt buyers, for agencies, for law firms, and for creditors. So I did get to look behind the curtain, so to speak, and see how the wizard was pulling the strings. And I have a respect for each one of those disciplines and what is really required to be successful in each one of those disciplines.
mm, mm. But yeah, I could pick your brain for hours on end about your experience with Complier, mate, but perhaps now's not the time. Broadly
Well, I feel
speaking,
like
how have you seen that compliance of the arm industry evolve? I mean, it's such a broad question that we could dig into, but
Well, I think
you're
from a compliance perspective, now you've got the application of AI. So I think when compliance first became a thing, it was all about how can I do this manually, and then it was like how can I track and record this manual action. Now I think we're getting to the point where instead of listening to a sample of calls, we're able to leverage artificial intelligence, listen to 100% of the calls, but kick the 5% that actually need to be heard over to the compliance team for live interaction.
yeah,
Whereas before we were randomly sampling a selection of 5% of the calls and seeing what handful of items we could come up with. So I feel like compliance has gotten significantly tighter, found its efficiencies. It's been an evolving marketplace for, I'm going to call it, 8 years. And I think you've had a lot of new players come to the marketplace because the natural voice automations or natural voice processing power that's available through all of the cloud computing platforms has really kind of changed things. You have some groups that have, kind of built on that and specialized on it further. You have others that are using some of these out of the box solutions and trying to build on top of that. But I find that the compliance business is one of those things that's like super personal to an organization, but has become, I don't want to say less important, but less a focal point in selecting an organization. I talked to a creditor recently who told me if there's more than 2 compliance slides in your deck, I'm done. And I kind of understand that point because everybody was trying to make it their product differentiator for such a
yeah,
long time. Now
yeah,
it's table stakes, guys. Like it is the ante to sit at the table at all.
yeah,
And I find that to be an interesting perspective and feel like I've now seen the full circle, so to speak, of compliance entering the market. It's just an expectation now. It's no
yeah.
longer something that, I mean, yeah, it's talked about at the conferences and there's constant education on how to stay on top of it and what is evolving. But the expectation of being compliant is not an option anymore. That is just the expectation.
Really good observation. Really, really good observation. Because yeah, I've seen that myself. And you're right. It's just a move. ChatGPT, mate, is it a force for good or force for bad? And is there a way in which the industry can use it for good? Because I know outside of collections, it's it's the hot topic everywhere. And when you talk about influential AI influencers, yeah,
So
ChatGPT, good or bad?
all I can say is, Dan, right? Do anything now. A simple command was able to break the safety and security layers and enable a machine to do things it should not have been allowed to do. Now,
Yeah,
I've also seen the open letters out there in the industry trying to slow the learning of AI, those kinds of things. I don't know if those are people vying for competitive advantage or people that truly feel fear. But the do anything now prompt is that basically broke the system. And if
mm,
it's going to break the system, I'm a little concerned about letting that system run rampant,
mm,
or enabling consumers sitting there playing with a bot like that and trying to break it until it does something that violates the law. And I mean, it's the United States. You can sue anybody for anything, anytime. And so I think it's something that needs to be investigated further. It needs to be tested significantly more before I'm
mm,
comfortable rolling that out. But I do think that there are some technologies that do fall within a controllable realm and can be tested and used in the space. So
mm,
I do believe that there is some technology that's been tested, used, and can be applied here, but specific engines that are hitting I'm going to say they're really shooting for quantum computing at this point. And I don't know. I don't know if the industry is ready from a regulatory standpoint to manage that, because the
Yeah,
guardrails are not appropriately set up for AI to this point. And you couldn't, with something like a chat GDP, if you get audited by the government, they come in, they say, well, what's in the black box? Well, you don't know because you don't own the black box. And so
yeah,
I think that there's some interesting challenges there and some ethical dilemmas that are going to need to be addressed by a group. I don't know who that group is. I hope I'm not on that. But right, like that's a set of questions that I don't know that I'm prepared to answer.
yeah,
I see the opportunity of enabling this, and I also see the threat. But a lot of that threat is going to come from regulatory or legal recourse should this thing ever get out of control or
yeah,
respond in an unauthorized way. AI that stays within its limits and within its box, I can kind of understand the collection space, but we're always a little slower to deploy technology, right? We've been physically capable of sending text messages for a long, long time. What we haven't been able to do is to understand the legal ambiguity that existed around sending those messages. And so I feel like until that kind of ambiguity becomes clear, right? Like until we can see through the water and we know what's swimming around us, it's
mm.
very difficult for us to take that plunge.
Well, and it takes me back to Cambridge Analytica, right? And if you don't pay for the product, you are the product. We were using a platform called Jasper.ai. I'm not sure if you've heard about it, but it was amazing AI driven content creation, and it was $100 a month, so it was incredible value. And then ChatGPT came along, and you could do the same thing for free. And it's incredible. Like you say,
For now.
I'm glass half full, half empty because I mean this. Obviously, it's a data play for them. Obviously, there's something in it for them to be providing it this way. But you're right, when you don't know what's driving it, open the code.
Hold on, but everything that you just said is for now. You don't have to pay for it for now. What they
Mhm.
need to do is get market share and they need to become a household brand, and
Yeah,
then they're going to start to put their payments in place.
yeah,
Let's not forget Facebook, Google, and all of these other tech companies that start off with some sort of a free service offering. But yeah, you're right. If you are not buying the product, you are the product itself.
yeah.
And that brings me down a whole other path. I feel like, Adam, we're going to have to continue this conversation at some point. I feel like this is a recurring segment that's starting right here in front of our very eyes. For those of you that are watching, if you have additional questions that you'd like to ask Adam or Adam, you can leave those in the comments below, and we'll be responding to those on LinkedIn and YouTube. If you have additional topics that you'd like to see us discuss or questions you'd like to submit for a future episode, I'm hoping I can get Mr. Wood back here again to help me continue creating great content for a great industry. Until next time, though, Adam, I really appreciate you coming on today. I always have a blast getting the chance to talk with you. This one definitely got reversed. I feel like this was a bilateral interview, which is my favorite type, because it is a lot more fun when we get to interact and just have a natural conversation. But for those of you that wanted to know what it's like to be a fly on the wall at the RMAI conference in 2020, you probably could have heard parts of this conversation.
100%, mate. And right back at you. Thank you. It's an honor. It's an honor to call you a friend and to know you, mate. Congratulations on everything over the last very hectic 2 years for you. And I would love to carry this conversation on, mate. You let me know when I'll be there.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. Looking forward to continuing this discussion. For all of you that are watching, we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, everybody.